Yeah, recording has been started. We are good to go, Chirag.
All right, great, excellent. Well, look, welcome everyone to the India Cloud Security Summit. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm hoping that you've seen some great presentations. I've seen a couple of them already, so absolutely a great day to learn all about security, really. So, my session is about deep dive into Microsoft Purview, but specifically, we're going to be looking at the content compliance aspects of it. So I put this session together on the basis where I've done some work with few clients, which normally happens as part of my migration services, and then the compliance comes into it, and before you know it, it almost becomes a bit of a project. So I hope to share some of those things, some of the things I've come across, some of the gotchas and all these things. So let's get started. Of course, please do stay around until end of the day. And I really wish you all the best in winning the prizes. But of course, I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for making this happen as well. So all credit to them. So we'll begin with something like around the content, the concepts and the approach in general when we talk about content compliance, because different people, different roles in their organization, it means different things to people. And of course, when we look at the Microsoft terminology, then that can be slightly confusing too when we're talking about the retention and the records management. So we'll deep dive into some of those things with a lot of demos, so that you hopefully get some idea where to step in and what to think about when you want to implement some of these policies to really look after your content. And then along the way, I'll share some good practices in order to, continue with your information governance journey. And at this point, I will assume your organization or maybe the clients who you're working with, pretty much everyone using Microsoft 365, things like SharePoint, Teams, and so forth. So, this is what, the content that we look at. So we'll dive into those things. Bit about me. I live and work in London. I'm a kind of M365 consultant, architect, trainer, so I wear multiple hats to deliver a lot of services around the SharePoint teams, generally migrations, really. But I'm also a certified trainer for 5 years of Microsoft. So, I tend to deliver a lot of courses around Purview as well as Teams, SharePoint, and I write my own courses for some of them. Six-time MVP in Teams and M365 category. So I tend to speak a lot and share, and I think I do see some familiar names in this Teams. So I'm always learning, just like from other MVPs, really. And we don't get paid, so we do this really out of our own pocket, if you like, and voluntarily. So really appreciate. QR code is there. If I'm able to help you, then please do reach out. I'm mainly on LinkedIn these days, so just drop me a message or something, and then I'll reply and so forth. All right. Okay. So why do we bother with content compliance? Because if you've got all the security in place, hopefully, we're all kind of, looking after our controls. We know roughly what our content is. We know what our files in SharePoint are, our emails in Exchange, Teams, chats, then hopefully we're good, right? Because it's within the Microsoft perimeter, if you like, where we can manage this content. So, few reasons really why we have to really understand the reasons behind it. So, main reason, of course, is that you want to avoid any financial penalties for storing your files or chats longer than necessary, right? So this is all about you should only look after content that's, what's been entitled to for what you're creating, and then be able to delete at some point in the future, maybe after 5 years or 7 years. Now, if your users are doing that already, then that's great. Yeah. Because in a ways, they're kind of complying with that. But unfortunately, that doesn't quite happen all the time because, people change their jobs, they come and go. Sometimes they don't get trained properly. So as a result, you get a lot of content kind of sprawling, and your storage costs increases as well in the future as well. So you got those things to worry about. And then, of course, at the same time, if you're storing some precious data, which we tend to call them as a high value data. So that could be things like employee records, maybe financial statements, reports, or any regulatory related information. So we have to try and address that challenge as well so that we are able to put in the relevant policies and then be able to protect that information from not staying longer, right? So that's what we're up against in terms of our challenge. Few organizations that I worked with, namely, Renewable Energy Housing Association, a couple of UK public sector councils. What I tend to find that, a lot of the time the projects they embark on, generally tend to be migration related, either from file shares or maybe from previous versions of SharePoint. But then along the way, you tend to come across the retention and record management pieces in which somebody doesn't quite own it, or maybe the IT owns it because they created some of the policies, but then it hasn't really got a journey to it in terms of who manages the decisions and the controls around it. So as a result, what happens sometimes is some of the processes are actually shortcutted. Yeah. So, straight away folks jump into the Microsoft Purview, start creating policies and hope for the best that things are being actually managed. So that's, the kind of things I see all the time. And of course, then you have to try and keep the momentum with these things because some of the projects I've been on, they go over 12 months. And because sometimes there is no requirements to see what actually retention records management requirements look like. So, I'll show you an example of that as well a bit later on. But we have to have some of those pieces in place before we really understand what policies to define and what controls within those policies should be implemented so that the users are all kind of hopefully on the same page and then they know exactly what labels, for example, to apply. And of course, in most cases, we want to try and automate a lot of this because, users don't have time. So we want to try and look at some of the uh, kind of classification criteria in order to automate the labeling of the content. So that's what we've got, right? Now, a lot of you should be hopefully aware of this, but we know that when we talk about teams or files, that lives in channels and so forth, a lot of this is based also on Microsoft 365 groups. That's the fundamental foundation, which controls the security as well as being connected mailbox and all the connected services that you might have, not just from a Microsoft point of view, but you might have some third party applications or services that potentially might connect to your groups too. So we have to think about in the holistic view when we're thinking about our policies to apply for retention so that all these workloads such as Teams, SharePoint, mailboxes are taken care of. Yeah, which a lot of you will be familiar with in terms of if you have designed your SharePoint properly, then you will know roughly what sort of sites you have. But then, of course, business changes, so you might, end up creating more sites, or you might use hub sites, and then you group things, and so your information kind of moves a lot. But then you got to somehow keep stable with your information architecture so that your retention compliance is still accommodated in those requirements. Now, you've probably seen a lot what's out there with, Copilot and the general wave of AI, right? So, with that, I mean, you're going to have even more content, right? That's going to be created, and not just, users created, but then Copilot responses to your prompts, you might have file references in there as well. So you got to take into account that scenario too as to how you're going to protect those files as well. So there's a link in there, and I'll share the slides afterwards. But you'll find a lot of guidance and information around those things. Very quick one on this. When you create your teams, chat spaces, if you like, and you got your standard, private, shared channels. Usually, the standard channels will create folders within your SharePoint site, and your private channels will create a dedicated SharePoint site as well. So when it comes to, again, when you're applying your policies, you have to have that view that how many sites are you dealing with, right? How many document libraries within that site you're dealing with. And if it's your mailboxes, how many mailboxes you're going to be dealing with. So all these things connected to Microsoft 365 group, that kind of gives you the overall content collaboration compliance posture, if you like, when you're trying to apply these different policies. So there's a number of things in play when we're looking at this sort of requirements. So Microsoft Purview, of course, as a lot of you will know, is the offering from Microsoft itself and is part of your license if you're on sort of E3 or E5 or maybe even Business Premium, right? And they generally put this in three buckets, right? To look after your data security, data governance, and of course risk and compliance. If you then break this down further, right, then you have a raft of solutions going on. Now, we're not going to cover a lot of this, right? Because in many cases, each of these are potentially a separate sessions. And I think in the past years, Cloud Security Summit have also got some sessions on these topics. But of course, what we're interested is the risk and compliance, in particular the data lifecycle management, as well as the record management. And there's that fundamentally they kind of control your retention and records management. The reason why they exist as two separate modules within Microsoft Purview is because of the licensing, right? And we look at that. How would you determine, based on your requirements, what particular module you should be looking for? So in some cases, it might be mandatory that you do have to go for record management. And so that's E5 feature, if you like, or E5 license requirement. And of course, data lifecycle management, you can get away with E3 or A3 if you're education or public sector. And then the other areas, you might find that some of the reporting, some of the kind of the configuration parameters, things like adaptive scope, right? All those things might come into play with different solutions within Microsoft Purview. So, so we don't look at things like information protection, although that is, generally speaking, part of your content compliance when you're applying your confidentiality on your content, but that falls within data security. So here we're looking at information governance aspects of it within this risk and category sort of things, so that we can manage all our risks, right, on this basis, and also manage that high value content within the records management. So that's, like I said, these are just few introductory slides before we jump into this. So all very well and said that, well, that's what it is. That's what the solution is. That's generally our requirements in terms of the data we actually hold within Microsoft 365. So where do you actually start from this, right? And of course, sometimes you have to get a lot of people involved in this. There's your legal folks, then there is your IT, and maybe even the business users themselves who's actually looking at this. So there's a raft of folks here that you need to think about. Naturally, you would want to begin this with any workshops, collect those requirements. Things like, as an example, could be retention schedule. Every organization should have one. If they don't have one, then as part of their, industry association regulatory body, they might have a template for it, and then you could tailor it to your requirements so that you can actually at least understand what sort of requirements you have. And of course, conducting interviews, surveys, and everything else, and knowing your data as well, right? And once you know your data, then you need to understand, well, what are the risks element in there? Because in my experience, when I conduct these workshops, I generally find that people don't just talk about retention or records management. They might even talk about sensitivity labels, right? They might even talk about things like e-discovery, to say that if we have a litigation and investigation, how does this work? So we have to be careful with our scope. But again, you can bring some of those conversations into this area when you're assessing this data for the risk point of view. And then last, you go about formulating a plan. And obviously, in some cases, it'll be phase by phase approach. And then obviously, you go ahead and implement your compliance solutions. Of course, in many cases, you might want to do it as a pilot and then roll it out into the full production use. And of course, the adoption area generally is a key factor to involve the users, managers early on. And of course, Microsoft provides great resource on their website, adoption.microsoft.com, which you can readily use some of the guidances available to plan your adoption strategy and the implementation. So yeah, generally 3 steps as far as that approach is concerned. So when we look at the actual solutions in terms of the differences between what we have within data lifecycle management and records management, you're generally looking at things around the actual things like disposition reviews, right? You're looking at some of the label the items when we talk about things like folders, the files. So if that falls within your requirements where you need your business users to actually manually review when something is coming to an expiry, then you need that disposition review process, then records management is what you will need, right? As well as if you have to formally declare that this file is a record, right? If you want that kind of functionality, you have records management for that. So those are some of the quick, obvious, quick wins to understand what module you need, plan your budget around it, make sure you have licenses for everyone to be able to go through that. And of course, you can do all that, what you can with the retention deletion, but data lifecycle management doesn't look at things like disposition, review, doesn't look at the actual management of the records themselves. And also, the fact that, when you have retention policies itself, which we'll look at in a sec, then you have far more control with retention policies than you would have, let's say, in records management. So you might use combination of these 2 modules to still use all the solutions available so that you have more flexibility to meet your requirements. Again, a lot of this is in preview. So as well as Teams, SharePoint, and all these things, you've got now all these, the AI experiences and apps appearing, right? So this is available in Microsoft Purview when you design some of these policies, but also, a lot of these are in preview too. So, I've personally not have tested, but you have a lot more to think about now when, you got Copilot experiences and then obviously ChatGPT and maybe even Google and others, right? So apps, AI apps, as they start to grow, you'll see this a lot lighting up in your experiences. Right. So let's jump into the demo. So a couple of slides ago, talked about how you can sort of look at the approach and all these things, assessing your data, right? So this is one of the tools I actually use when I look at the compliance manager side of things. to be able to see exactly what lies in my tenant, right? So typically it gives you a bit of a score in terms of, in this case is 51%. And then I've got a list of improvement actions, which basically I can access within my Microsoft Purview solutions. And there's my compliance manager, right? So that's how I get to it. If you're part of any regulation authorities, you can create assessments based on that regulatory body. You will get a ready-made improvement actions. Microsoft maintains this. And of course, if there are any premium templates you want to use, like data protection or others that might be very industry specific, there is an add-on license for those things to be able to use. But generally speaking, for a set of that regulation body. I've got a few actions in here, which I can see that, some of them are actually falling as high risk, right? And I can actually try and meet one of those things. And essentially each action carries some number of points, and those points then add up to the overall solution, if you like. In this case, I've got on the right-hand side audit, and I've got compliance score and all these other solutions, in which then I get the overall score. And the idea is not to get maximum, but high enough to make sure that you are governed in every way possible to be able to look at that. So if I dive into that detail, for example, like, create and publish or automate, apply these retention labels, then I can actually go into the, already that I've got this opened, into improvement actions. And I've got one action there called create and publish a label, right? It's a 0 out of 27. And I can just basically go into that detail for that particular create and publish that retention label. It'll open up a detailed page. Once it opens up, it'll give me a bit of a guidance as to, how to go about implementing that. If I have to supply the evidence, which in most cases you will need to do that, then you will just simply go and add that evidence. It could be a Word document, could be a screenshot, could be anything, right? But at the top, you can see, right, there are many things like the status, test status, and all these things. So some of these are automated, right? So you don't really have options to change the implementation status because the tenant will automatically detect all those things in the way you want it. So just think about your improvement actions from that point of view to see exactly what your sorry, excuse me, too many screens. So, to see how you can control some of these policy retentions. And there are all the other compliance and other configurations, not just from retention and records, but also from e-discovery, information protection, and all the other Purview solutions that you saw in that earlier slide. Okay, so that's from an assessment point of view. So I'm just going to quickly jump back to the slide there. And so when you start the actual process to understand when you plan your data lifecycle in records management, then you want to probably think about from the automation point of view right early on. So what we do is basically we try and understand what are the adaptive scope feature set that we have in terms of what attributes we could use. So this typically there are three of those, right? There's the user attributes, things like the office location, where and the country they work in, and you might have some custom attributes as well, which you might use, which usually resides in your Exchange mailbox, and you could pick up those custom attributes to feed into your adaptive scope definition, and then be able to try and use that in your labeling for automation, right? So SharePoint works in the same way too. You can grab a site URL, the other properties like refinable strings. So if you've created any search experiences and solutions and you're using those managed properties, you can bring those in here so that your metadata, if you're using them in SharePoint, suddenly takes an automation route to automatically just label the files wherever they are in your SharePoint system and be able to then be able to apply the labels automatically. Same as Microsoft 365 group and the attributes as well. Yeah. So that's an optional, it's not mandatory, but it'll really help to speed up your process to apply labels very quickly automatically. So once you've got that, then you come to apply your actual policies itself. So in this case, retention policies is one of the easiest ways to be able to look through the actual aspects of creating those policies. So, typically I would go into data lifecycle management, and then within there, I've got my policies, and I can simply go to retention policies. So this policy here is all about applying it to the entire content, such as SharePoint site or a mailbox. It doesn't care whether you've got 10 document libraries or 100. It's going to apply a policy to the entire SharePoint. So if you know that you've got a good organization of sites in your tenant, then this is a very good starting point and get complying very quickly across your content. So I've got one policy here called Teams Chat. So I can create one policy here to say, for example, let's say we can call this finance policy. And I'm not going to create a lot of these things, but you just have to assume that, in the background, this is going to go and apply based on the parameters I use. Next step you got is things like what we call policy scope, which basically means if you've got multiple IT departments in different countries and so on, you want them to manage the portion of your tenant administratively, you can create admin units. So they appear not just within the retention areas, but also in other areas of Microsoft Purview. So in this case, we're just going to use the full directory that we have available in our environment. This is the bit I was talking about, the adaptive scope, right? User, your SharePoint and Microsoft 365 group. So this is a dynamic way to actually manage so that you don't have to come to this wizard every time when you have to make a change to be able to use. So let me just show you quickly what that means. So, if you pick adaptive, then I can go into adaptive scope to basically be able to choose what scope that I've already defined to use. So you can see everything's grayed out at the bottom. I have no control to choose which mailboxes or which SharePoint sites. But what I can say is that I'm going to choose a scope here, which I've already defined. I've called it IAO, Information Asset Owner, and is actually based on the user type. So the actual user type attribute is in my Exchange mailbox, and there's a custom attribute field which you get about 15 of those, and I've used one of those things. So I've called it IAO in Exchange, so then I have to call it IAO in here when I'm defining my attribute, and that's all I'm doing at this point, which basically means that anything that I actually label automatically is going to pick up the mailbox attributes. So if I've got like hundreds of mailboxes with those attributes, it's going to go and pick that up and apply policies to those mailboxes just like that automatically. So I don't have to worry about when people join the organization or they leave the organization. As long as that attribute is filled in as part of your onboarding process, this policy is going to work like a magic. Yeah. So it's just an example to show you that adaptive scope takes all that control away to do things manually, and then your content is made automatically then labeled. Static, I want to show you because there's a bit more information. So initially you might go with these options so that you have full control, exactly which sites you're applying to, which which groups. And so you can see here, right? I've got Exchange Mailbox, SharePoint Classic communication sites. That could be your intranets and so forth, right? So I scroll down, I've got OneDrive, team sites, mailboxes. So, any team SharePoint team sites, connected mail group boxes and all those, they're all connected there. And as I scroll down, you can see, right, there's a whole lot more. There's Skype for Business, which hopefully not many are using, but Teams chats, right? So you got Teams chats. This could be your personal group chats. You can add or exclude any particular users if you want. You can create those Teams private channel-based message policies. The list goes on. Obviously, Viva Engage is around, and they haven't even renamed Yammer to Viva Engage, but it's kind of the same thing too, right? So again, you have the options, and what you might find is that you'll not have one policy to target all this content, because as I'm changing these options, the other one comes off. So you might have to create few policies if you have to target different content areas within your tenant. And then at the bottom, you got these co-pilot experiences, enterprise AI apps, and so on. So, use it to your requirements as to which content you want to target, right? And then from there, you can just go ahead and say, okay, well, in this case, I'm going to target all my group-based mailboxes, all the team sites. I'll target maybe even OneDrive, and maybe even Exchange mailboxes. And so once I do that, I can then proceed next stage, right? And the next stage, this is the critical part, right? You know, because we are applying the policy that's going to target every single piece of content in my SharePoint and mailbox. So I can choose to say, well, do I want to retain that for 7, 10, or maybe I can put, years, months, and days to be more specific. Or in this case, got retention, which means basically when does the clock start, right? So it's either when files have been created or when they were last modified. So again, you can pick your options. If you think those two options meet your requirements, great. You can go with that, delete items automatically, or just do nothing and so on. And then from there, you can just go ahead and then click next. And then obviously it takes few days or whatever, and depending on your data amount, it will then start to create the retention policy. That's generally the gist of it when it comes to the retention policies when you're trying to create those things. But I had only two options there, which was date created or date modified when I based my policy on, right? So that's one option there, right? So from here on, when I created my retention policies, pretty much that's what I kind of went through, those particular content areas that I want to pick. But then I want to get more granular about it to try and now create retention label and its policy as well. So there's a two-step process here in order that for that policy to be fully published and available for the users so that they can manually apply it, or in most cases, they might want to set as a default on their folders, on their document libraries, to be able to then pick the actual label itself. So this is that area which allows us to do that. Again, if I have to meet additional requirements, I would feed in the disposition review, define my stages, define my reviewers, for example, who's going to carry out that review, and also event triggers, right? So in my retention policy, I only had two options, date created and date modified. But let's say I have a company that that makes products and I have to store the documentation, the specs, and all these things, then I might want to start the retention based on that product lifetime, right? Or maybe the employees, when the employee leaves your organization, you might have to retain that records, interview notes, application forms, appraisals, whatever, right? For 7 years. So that 7 years usually start from the date when the employee has left. If those are the sort of requirements you might have, then you want to consider event-based labels, which pretty much is part of retention label. And you can define your own events, right? And then be able to create and submit those dates as well. And then the third one here is to declare the records. So again, you might create different policies based on those requirements. So again, these are separate configuration options. We'll look at that in a second. And then, once you've done that, essentially you've defined your policies, and then you then think about to create the auto labeling itself. So then you can try and automate to apply labels in a different ways. So let's look at that, the retention labels. Just looking time-wise, we got about, I believe, 10 odd minutes. So, we're doing good. So in here, I can go to my retention labels. So here, what I created earlier was this retention policies, or at least I try to create one. So now I will go into the step above, retention labels. So this is my definition bit. This is my configuration. You can see I've got a few sample retention labels, things like 1 day retention delete, few conferences I've spoken at, there's the other one, collab days, and so on. So again, I can go ahead and create my retention label here, and I can say maybe this is finance data. Again, think about your naming conventions here, because once you name these retention labels and you want to go back afterwards to rename it, you won't be able to do that. So definitely remember that one if you can. So in this case, I've got a few options. Mainly, I'm interested in this one, retain item for specific period. That's usually the big requirement, right? So I can go ahead and click next on that one. And it's very similar to retention policy that I created, right? I get the same sort of time periods I can choose, but instead of having created and last modified, I get additional options now, right? And this is the power of retention label, that I have full control as to what events types that I want to be able to support with this requirement of retention label. So I can go and choose product lifetime, right? So that way I can choose my event-based label. But just to keep simple, I'll keep this one as when items were last modified. Click next. And now I get even more options compared to the retention policy, where there I think I only had things like retain and delete, right? So now I've got started disposition review. I've got changed the label, and I can even bring Power Automate if you're using Power Platform to automate a lot of your content and everything else. I could say that, when this policy is in action, then run a flow to maybe potentially inform somebody, right, that this is coming to an end or whatever it is, or maybe create a set of documents in another SharePoint site. Whatever that business process is, you can build your flows first and then run them by choosing this option. Some cases you might want to deactivate, and that's fine too. So you got all sorts of things going on there, right? So if I go and pick start a disposition review, then of course I can choose my stages to assign the reviewers. So I've got automatic stage, or I can then create my stage, maximum 5 stages. And let's say this is initial stage, click OK. And then I can choose my users who's going to be reviewing these things. I would probably use mail-enabled security groups, because users come and go. You don't want to come into this wizard every time when somebody has left or joined. So you can use those mail security groups, and that way you can create 5 stages based on your governance process, so that relevant people will get the emails to basically carry out that options. Again, I'll finish this off here, but so far I'm not able to create a formal record, right? So that's the sort of stuff you can't do within this data lifecycle management. But in this case, once I've done this particular policy, actually I haven't filled in anything here, that's why, then my label would be created, and then I would go into creating to publish my labels, right? So that would complete that part of the step. But I'm not going to publish that yet, because I want to step out from data lifecycle management and to go into records management, right? So this is very similar to data lifecycle management in that I've got this additional module called file plan. So this gives me a greater capabilities. So I still see my labels that I had in data lifecycle management. These are exactly the same things, but you can see the metadata across. It gives me information such as, is this label a record? Some are yes, some are no, right? Is this regulatory record or not? So now I've got more control to be able to build all this into it. The key part here is that if you have a retention schedule, right, you can actually import that into here. Obviously, you have to tidy up based on this template that Microsoft provides. But once you do that, you can create 50, 100, 200 labels, right? You don't want to create these things manually because you need a lot of time and effort. So what you can do is you can pick your particular retention schedule, and this could be a requirement, right? This is a sample document. I've got it from the internet, gives you a good overview around what type of records you might want to manage based on, what the trigger is, what's the minimum period that you need to consider and what's the recommended. So these things might be in your retention schedule. Your records manager might have a copy of this, so you can go through that. And if I type in reports to find, what sort of retention policies I have, this one says, okay, if it's an internal audit correspondence, email, letter, or whatever, meeting minutes, then you have to store that for 5 years, recommendation, right? And then after 5 years, it says securely destroy. So hence, I would create my policy to reflect this requirement. And that's generally how these things work. But I'll leave that to you on that part to work out. But here, other than that, when I create my label in the retention, I'll just go quickly through this wizard, then I'm getting this extra step to define which department, which authority, which standard reference that I'm using to reference that particular retention schedule. So I can bring all that in here. And then I get the same options which I had in the data lifecycle management. So I can go through that option, same sort of options, create my events if I want, click next. And now, in addition to all the options that I had, I get this option too to say, do I want to make this report a record? And if I do, then this option appears in people's document library when they browse to the files. Yeah. So it's a very quick tour of some of these wizards, if you like, when you try and create these things. So just to quickly wrap up on the demo side of things, is the final thing is that when you're publishing these labels, you want to then think about how best you can automate those things. So if I go to my label policies, right, I can go and apply automatically these labels. So I can pick this one here, for example, 1-day retention, delete that targets mailboxes, SharePoint, and so on. And if I go through that key wizard in this one, which, yeah, there you go. So I've got 4 classifications. I can use sensitive information types, which I can use based on credit card, passport numbers, and so on. Or I can use specific words or phrases. That could be my content types in SharePoint, could be my metadata as well, site columns, or generally any phrase within the document. So we'll go and grab those documents as a way to apply these labels automatically based on those labels that I've tried to create there, right? You can use trainable classifiers as well as cloud attachments and links. So, when people are sharing a lot of files and then, links are going in emails, you want to try and capture a particular version within that as well. So you can choose all of those, well, one or the other anyways, to be able to automate your labels there. And then from there, it's basically just business as usual, just a bit like the first policy when we created where you want to target. So I'm choosing static scope, so I still have a control as to which sites I want to be able to add it to. And in this case, I can then add the label that I'm trying to publish it. So I can maybe go something like, I don't know, collab days press release, add, and then that way I can just publish my policy and it will automate. So, okay, in some cases you can test the policy before you run it. It's important you do that. In certain cases, you might not get the option, especially with trainable classifiers. So just think about that before you go ahead and apply all the labels in all your content. So, that's pretty much the full life cycle I wanted to cover off. And then there are reports anyways, things like, Data Explorer, Content Explorer Classic, which, is kind of becoming legacy now. So you can look at your label analytics reports in various ways from there on. Anyway, so that's pretty much on this part here, which we kind of covered a lot of the steps. And then we obviously labeled our content, few screenshots in terms of what you have, how the cloud attachments work. It can be a bit tricky, so I'll leave this for you to consume as to the point when it's actually moved all the way to the recycle bin and permanently deleted. Adaptive scopes we briefly talked about. So these are all the attributes you can use to try and automate your labelings based on the dynamic data. And then of course you have to think about the roles too. So there are multiple role groups you can create within Purview. You can classify it and say, somebody gets a record management role, or maybe somebody might just get the label itself. So yeah, absolutely. Have a look at those roles. There are conflicts sometimes when you have multiple labels within your environment. So usually the retention wins over deletion if you have multiple retention labels, all the way down to shortest deletion period. So again, this guidance is on Microsoft's website, and also a good MVP, Joanne Klein in Canada. She's got a good blog articles as well around this explanation of how this works as well. So take a look at those things. Okay, I think I'm on time. So generally, make sure your information architecture, the design of your content is rock solid. If you don't have a retention schedule, you don't have any particular requirements, think about the retention policies to begin with. That will cover majority of your content. But for anything precious requirements and data, especially your financials and any high value items, then take time out to understand exactly what content that is so that you can create those retention label policies accordingly. Yeah, so last one is there is the integration with DLP policy conditions. So this, whatever you create, the retention labels, you can bring them into other Purview solutions. And one of my favorites around this is relying on e-discovery as well as SharePoint Premium. If you're using the syntax capability, you can actually automate a lot of this stuff. And of course, SharePoint Premium is a pay-as-you-go model as well. So that will depend on your data too. Few resources, take a look. And then obviously everything that I've shown you today, it's all available in step-by-step screens and so forth as well. So with that, just want to say big thanks to the sponsors, the organization team, Vignesh, Vijay, this everybody else in the team and the volunteers, also the fellow speakers today, and of course in the chat you can see there is a next session coming up on data security meets AI. My good friend Raphael from Germany, so hang around for that one. But yeah, until then, hope to see you online or maybe somewhere at some conferences. I'm speaking at a number of events coming up later this year, and I hope to see you there if you're around. So thank you very much. And any questions, please unmute, ask me, or maybe put it in the chat. And I'm around for the next hour at least, anyways, because I've got India and England at Lord's. And I'm a big cricket fan, so I do need to get back on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chirag, for your